All right, just so that you know, I'm just for testing purposes, just to get used to it. I've of course live streamed before, and I'm using OBS software to live stream directly to YouTube, so I don't have to record and then upload them later. Again, as announced on Piazza, this is a potential. If school gets shut down, then we'll switch over exclusively to this. And just to get in the habit of it, I started doing it, and I never trust these things. So if you want to, you can go to my YouTube channel, the live channel, and verify that the audio is working. I mean, I've got bars over here in OBS, but I never trust it, and I don't think that yeah. Once I've started live streaming, I won't be able to get the audio on my computer. So if somebody wants to go there and verify that it's actually running, let me know. Otherwise, we are live streaming right now. If you are logged into YouTube, then you can go ahead and comment over here, and I'll see it. But if you really want to, but in the this morning's section, apparently there were comments, but there were just some random internet people. So, I don't know. I don't know who most. I've got 700 subscribers. I have no idea who they are. It's probably bots mostly, unfortunately. But okay, I'm getting a signal that we are live streaming now, but I don't know about the audio. If somebody wants to check that it works, okay, great. Then I'm good. We can go ahead and go forward here. Today, we're going to be covering Jdbc, which is Java Database Connectivity API. And again, like usual, it's going to be like a tutorial session. I'll show you actually how to do it with minimal notes. In fact, I've already got them up here. But basically, what we're going to be doing is we're going to programmatically access your databases. That is, we're going to write Java instead of typing out a bunch of queries in MySQL Workbench and working within MySQL Workbench. We're going to be writing Java code to do essentially the same thing. That it's going to go to your database, it's going to make a query, it's going to get process results over the wire, and then you can bring that into your application. Again, most languages have some sort of an API for doing this. If you remember when you were doing C, say last semester, one of the last labs that we did was the video game database. And if you did the C version, you did ODBC, which is Open Database Connectivity API. JDBC is for Java Database Connectivity API. And an API is nothing more than an application programmer interface. This is a perfect illustration of one of the D principle in the solid principles. Remember, dependency inversion. Basically, the idea is that you don't write code to access a MySQL database. And unfortunately, you do this in PHP because it's so tightly woven in with MySQL. But if you wrote code to only access data from a MySQL database, guess what? If you change vendors and you move over to Postgres, or you go to IBM, or you go to Oracle or something like that because you need to scale up, you start paying for something, MS SQL, you're rewriting everything. So what you don't want to do that. What you want to do is you want to have loose coupling so that you can take your database, throw it out completely, bring in a new vendor, and not have to rewrite any of your code. And that's exactly what an API does. It does dependency inversion. Instead of writing code that depends on low-level details like going to a MySQL database, you write code that is dependent on an interface. And then the vendors are responsible for writing a driver that conforms to that interface. So you're inverting the dependency. Instead of high-level modules being dependent on low-level modules, now you've inverted that. Again, I don't like the term inversion because you're not inverting it. You are making them side by side. Here's your database. Here's your Java code. Here is the driver that is published by Oracle or whatever, and then they both depend on this thing sitting in between, which is an interface or an API, an application programmer interface. You don't program towards a specific database. You program towards the API, the actual interfaces instead. JDBC provides, the way that we're going to walk through this is we're going to be looking at 3 different things. It provides a lot of things, but these are the 3 things that we're going to focus on. A connection to the database, being able to create and prepare a statement that you want to execute on the database, And then if it's a select statement, you expect results back. So you want a result set. This is basically just a programmatic way of doing things that you already did in MySQL Workbench. When you open up MySQL Workbench, you need to connect to your database, right? That's the first step. You set up a connection. You provided a URL, a username, and a password, and the exact same thing will be done in Jdbc. Then you wrote your query out in the query, box, right? IDE, you had a plain text editor, you could type your queries. We'll do the same thing, but we'll also prepare them. Then, once you execute a query, you got that Excel-looking kind of dialog where you had headers, and then each row had a result, and that's your result set. So everything that you did in MySQL Workbench, we're going to be doing programmatically using Java code instead. Because the vast majority of you're never going to really, you're only using IDE for SQL when you're developing stuff. When it's actually in production, you don't write SQL queries and then hit enter, right? You have a program that's automating all this stuff for you. There are also ORMs, and that's something that we might cover in the honors section here. In particular, JPA. I've got a video on it. I've got an extra lab 10.5 is on JPA. Otherwise, there are other applications like Juke. That's probably how you pronounce it. I'm not sure how you pronounce it, but those are ORMs, object relational mappings, or object relation mappings, where you don't write JDBC code directly that goes to the database to select things out. Instead, you annotate your classes. You say that this class has a connection to this table over here, and this variable in this class has a connection to this column in this table over here, and then it takes care of all of it for you. Right? You don't have to write any actual querying code. That's all auto-generated by the framework. The JPA or Hibernate is what you would usually use. But we're going to keep down low level here for a moment just to see how things work. So I'm going to go through a demonstration here of how to set yourself up to actually connect to a database. And we're going to process that film and director data that we worked on a couple of weeks ago. We built this database that had a film table, an actor table, a join table in between, and then a director table. So a director could direct many films. One film had one director, but one director could direct many films. We're going to go ahead and operate on that data. We'll forget about the actors for now and keep it simple. Right? It's the same basic process here. You load up the data. There's a 5-step process. You load up the JDBC driver. That might be optional depending. You create a database connection. You prepare a query, and then you execute that query. And if it returns a result set, if it's a select statement, then you need to process that result set. And then always, last but certainly not least, is you need to remember to clean up your resources at the end. This would be like a memory leak in C if you didn't do this. So you could end up with connections that aren't closed, that are persistent, and wasting resources on both the server end and on the client end. Or in worst case scenario, you might run out of connections because I think you have a 30 connection limit to CSE. If you open up 30 connections and you try to open up that 31st connection, nope, it's going to kick you out. Right? So let's go ahead and start by downloading the appropriate jar here. Let me go ahead and open up a web browser over here. I'm just going to search for Java Connector J. This is the driver that's put out by Oracle for MySQL databases. We're using MariaDB, of course, but it's still 100% compatible. It's a binary compatible replacement. You can go ahead and select platform independent, and then download either a tarball, or tarball is just a zipped tar file. Tar is tape archive, if you're familiar with that. It's just a way of gathering up a bunch of files and then storing them to tape archive. Right? We don't even have tape archives anymore, but still, lots of people still use tape archives. I think we talked about that last semester. Why? You remember? Very briefly, I mentioned it. A lot of people still use tape backups. Like reams of tape, of magnetic tape. Why? It's by far the cheapest way of long-term storage. Per byte of data that you store on a tape, that's the cheapest way that you can ever do it. Right? Still the cheapest way. In fact, we looked it up, didn't we? We talked about that last. In fact, we looked it up. What was magnetic tape Not okay. I'm getting magnetic data tape. All right, I want to buy it though. Best magnetic. Okay. I seem to remember having more. Who? New egg. I'm sure that. Well, we probably get magnetic tape there too. Storage tape drive. Okay, that's the drive. Okay, that's not, well, it's not worth it. It's a VHS. Okay, wow. Okay, it's not worth it anymore. All right. But byte per byte or cost per byte, it's definitely still the cheapest, at least the last time I checked it was. All right, so there's the tarball that I downloaded. All you're going to need is this one jar file. It, of course, comes with a full source if you really want to jump in there and start playing around with the actual Jdbc, the code. But otherwise, all we're going to need is this jar file right here. I'm going to go ahead and bring it into my project. Do a lib folder here. Copy it. Add it to my build path. And there we go. I'm now set up to actually make connections here. And now I just need to start writing some Jdbc code. This is a driver that is put out by Oracle. MySQL.com is owned by Oracle. If I, of course, was going to a Postgres database, then I would need to go to a Postgres vendor and say, I need a jar file to connect through Java, and it would be their responsibility to publish that. All right. So let's go ahead and go over to film here. I've already got this set up that I want a method here that is going to load up all of the films in my database. And then over here in the demo, I'm just simply printing them out. And right now, all it's doing is returning this empty array list here. So let's go ahead and change that first of all, and call it films is equal to this, and then we'll return films. Right. Now what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to connect to the database and pull all that data associated with all films, and then build my objects, my film objects and my director objects, and then put those into this list here. I'm going to come back over here and I'm going to cut and paste this step-by-step process here, so that when I write this code, you'll see what each one of these pieces is doing. 4 and 5. There we go. So I said that this might be optional because if there's only one jar file, you might be able to get away without doing this. But if you've got a more complex project that is going to several different databases or for whatever reason, and you've got a Postgres jar file in there, and you've got a MariaDB jar file, and you've got a DB2 IBM file or whatever, a jar file, then you have to load up the appropriate one in the context so that it knows which database you're actually connecting to. So I need to open this up. There we go. All right. There we go. All right. So to do this, I need to do some what's called some reflection. Right? The way that this is done is class.forName or name, and then the driver class. And that's a string that I'm going to have to set here in a second. New instance. There we go. All right. So the driver class in this case, I'm just going to cut and paste this one because it's just that you have to look at the jar file and see where the driver is, or you have to read the documentation, find out where the driver is. In this jar file over here, in the package com, and under that the subpackage MySQL, subpackage CJ, subpackage JDBC, there is this file called driver. In fact, you can go to it, and there it is. It's right in there. It's in the. No, sorry, that's going to be the interface. Sorry. So I would have to go back and open up this jar file and look through its contents and find that one particular class file if I really want to. In fact, we can look at the source if you want to. Where was it? Java. Nope. Main maybe. Core API. Java. Com. MySQL. CJ. JDBC. Where is it? It's not in here. It's somewhere else. Oh well. It's somewhere in here. You'd have to go fishing and diving for it, but that's where it is. Okay. Now this is complaining here for a couple of reasons. First of all, a lot of stuff when you're working with JDBC is going to be throwing checked exceptions. This, in my mind, at least in my opinion, illustrates exactly the shortcomings of why checked exceptions are bad. Because these exceptions are going to be thrown for pretty much anything. That if you don't have a network connection, you can't connect to a remote database. If you've got the wrong password, right? If you've got a bad SQL statement that doesn't conform to SQL syntax, all these things will result in an SQL exception, which is a checked exception. How can you reasonably recover from any of that stuff? So it illustrates the inconsistency in the standard that was written 20 years ago, but we're still living with it today. So unfortunately, our solution here is just going to be to try and catch, and I'm going to simplify this to any exception. And what do we do with checked exceptions? We just catch and release, right? Just like you would any fish. You catch a fish, you don't want to eat it, so you release it. So I'm going to throw a new runtime exception, and I will wrap up E and just rethrow it. Okay? That's the first thing. The second thing is probably new to you. Have you ever seen this before? Where your IDE is crossing something out? That's because it's been deprecated. If you read the note here, the method new instance of the type blah, blah, blah is deprecated since version 9. In other words, if you were working in Java less than 9, then this is how you would do it. But in Java 9 plus, they changed it. And I believe that it is, what is it? I forget. No, darn it. I'm going to have to look at my notes now. Where is it? I forgot what it is. 9 plus. Nope. Fine, 9 plus. There we go. So it's this thing, and I'm just going to bring it over. There. So get declared constructor, and then you do a new instance. Deprecation. Oh, yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Now, why this was changed in 9, that tells me that maybe it has something to do with the module system introduced, but I don't really think, I don't know, I don't see why that would be related to that. That's definitely like the warnings. That's the module system. Yeah, it may or may not be the same thing here, but basically they deprecated this. What deprecation means is that they said, well, this is bad. We don't want to support this anymore. So we're going to deprecate it, meaning that you can still use it. You don't have to go with this, but I will, since it's the newer version. You can still use that stuff, and we might keep it for a few more years to get everybody used to doing it the new way. But at some point in the future, expect us to cut off support for this. That's exactly what the warnings were with, not JSON, but Xstream, right? Yeah, Xstream was issuing warnings because it wasn't built with the new module system, and in the future, we might not allow you to do this. And well, okay, whatever. It's been at least 3-4 years since they introduced the module system. You're still allowing it, and if you didn't allow it, you'd have people busting down your door so quick that you'd be breaking 20 years of Java code by doing that. So, but that's how you advertise that some features are going to maybe be cut in the future. It's called deprecation. Once it's deprecated, doesn't mean that you can't use it. It's just that it means that you shouldn't use it going forward on any new stuff, and be careful, it might break someday. So you might want to consider going back and updating your code. And I'll update it like this. Again, all this is doing is loading up this driver class here into the Java virtual machine so that it knows about it, so that it knows that it needs to connect to this MySQL database. If it were a different jar file and a different driver to connect to a Postgres database, it would be a different string. Okay? And again, I said that that's optional because if there's only one, it can probably figure it out. But I don't take chances. I write only intentional code, right? I don't cross my, I'll always cross my fingers, but I try to make it so that that's not necessary, that you're not relying on the crossed fingers, right? Make sure that you're writing intentional code at all times. Now we need to create a connection to our database. And to do that, we have this object called connection. And I'll just call it con for now because, well, there's no better name for it. In general, short names like that are the same as the class or C, right? C is con is a little bit better than C, but there's no other descriptive name for this, right? It's not like list of brokers or list of films, in this case films. We're calling this just F or things, right? That would be bad naming conventions. But it's not that bad of a naming convention to name a connection con because how much more descriptive can you be, right? All right, so I need to create this connection, and to do so, I'm going to rely on this driver manager. Driver manager, which has been loaded up through reflection through this code this block of code right here. Driver manager, please get me a new connection. Well, it's going to require a URL, a username, and a password. Just like you required when you loaded up a MySQL Workbench and you had to provide a URL, cse.unl.edu, the database that you wanted to connect to, your password, your username, right? So I need to create all those as strings. The URL, string, username, and I'm going to be using my username, password. Storing passwords in source files, is that a good idea? No, but it's not that bad of an idea for this. And this is why I told you don't use any password that you care about with respect to your database stuff, because it will eventually appear in your source code, and or if you're working with a partner, you'll eventually be sharing it with your partner. So I'll share with you my password. It's not the same password as I use as anything else, or just for 156. There you go. All right. So don't change that. Hopefully nobody in the earlier section stole my password and changed it and is mucking around with the database. But you can do that, and it will be changed later on. It's not that big of a deal. You can only just get to a bunch of demonstration tables, that the stuff that we've been doing in class. The URL looks like that. So I'll give you a few minutes to copy that down. Don't worry. It'll be posted along with this code. This is a protocol. It's a Jdbc protocol that's going to connect to a MySQL database. The actual URL is cse.unl.edu / and then you'll need to change this because you'll need to change that to your login because you're not going to have access to my database. Make sure that you're connecting to your database. So this database, this URL, this username, and this password will need to be changed accordingly to your own credentials. Right? The rest of this stuff is just necessary workarounds for the configurations on CSE. Don't worry about it. Right? When I post it, you just use it. Right? Okay. This is, again, complaining. I need to surround it with a try catch. Okay, come on. There we go. And I will simply just rethrow the exception. You'll see that it's throwing an SQL exception. Pretty much anything that you do will throw a checked SQL exception. You just have to deal with it. Try and catch everything. Again, it is a design flaw, in my opinion, that was made 20 years ago, but we're still living with it today. It was corrected in JPA. There are no checked exceptions in JPA, so you can even see that the Java folks themselves seem to have realized how much of a mistake it was because they never repeated that mistake 20 years later. Right? Everything now, usually, I don't see any new stuff with checked exceptions anymore. But this is a connection. Now, if I run this program, we can actually, troubleshoot it, and no news is good news because it's not actually doing any data. But if we had screwed up and, had the wrong password, then it would manifest itself as an SQL exception, access denied for user, blah, 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 using password, yes, but of course I'm using the wrong password. So let me go ahead and undo that. Pretty much if you get anything wrong, you're going to get some sort of an SQL exception like this, along with a full stack trace. All right, so I've made my connection. Now I need to create and prepare a query. I want all the data associated with a film, this data at least, the film ID, the title, and the director. And in this case, the director is an object. Well, the director is a director ID, a first name, and a last name. So I want 5 pieces of actual data total, right? Let me go ahead and create my select statement. Select, well, let's just go ahead and select everything for now. From film F, join. Do I have to do a left join? Remind me. Do I have to do a left join to the director table? No, why? Can a film exist without a director? Not the way that we designed it a couple weeks ago. You might not remember. Okay. And there. Now, obviously, is that going to be Java code? No. I put my query into a string. Now, here's a use case in which you might want to go old school. String. And use caps for everything. Select from. Why might you want to do that? Yeah. It's all the same color. Or you can download a plugin so that will highlight that'll auto detect that this is this looks like an SQL string, so it'll go in and syntax highlight the stuff there too. Or you can use Juke, and then you can use, I think you can natively use SQL statements within the Java code, and it'll take care of it for you. I'm not sure about that. I haven't used it, but there are tools like that. And I just need a semicolon to get rid of that. Long lines can be, of course, broken up with an enter. And I don't like the default way of doing that. I like to see my pluses on the end, and then I like to see things lined up. Go ahead and add as much white space as you want to make it look nice. In fact, you can even bring all this and align this stuff. This is just a style guide kind of thing, right? Align all those quotes and stuff like that. It doesn't matter as long as you're consistent about it. Right. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if you've got a function or a method that loads up one particular object, then yeah, you're going to have to go to the database and get that stuff. If you want, again, if you're wanting to use a more sophisticated framework, JPA built on top of Jdbc, then you've got object managers. So where you say that I'm going to create this director, and then the manager handles its persistence back and forth to the database. That if I make changes to it in memory, I can set it up so that it automatically persists to the database. Or if something else comes in and changes the database, it automatically reloads my object, and the object is persistent in memory. Usually you do this on like an application server though. And JPA is your solution for something like that. But yeah, you can see immediately here that loading up the driver, creating a connection, that seems really boilerplate to me. Maybe, and in fact you have to, because it's an honors requirement, maybe you should think of a way of doing that a little bit better by putting it into a factory function or a factory object or something like that that's responsible for that stuff. All right. So yeah, don't store the password in 50 different locations. Store it one place. Right. All right. There is. Oh, here I need to move this up here. There's my query. Now, how do I actually submit that query? I need a statement, a prepared statement. There are just regular old statements. I'm not even going to cover them because you never want to use them for security reasons. A prepared statement does everything that you want and more. Prepared statement, PS for short, I'll set that equal to null. And of course, I'm going to get a result set back because I'm selecting all this stuff. So I will want a result set. RS is equal to null. Okay? Now, I want to prepare this statement, and I want to prepare this query. My connection is going to do that for me. The driver manager gave me my connection. The connection is going to prepare my statement, or PS equals con.prepare statement, and I just give it to my query. My prepared statement is going to return me my result set, ps.execute query. So the connection is going to prepare that statement. The prepared statement is you can execute it, and it gives you back this result set right here. And again, this is going to be a try, catch, And it's going to end up with an SQL exception that I will just catch and release. Right? Now, process the results. Right? So the way that we do that is with this result set. This result set is basically like that. I keep calling it an Excel-like table because that's what it looks like in my SQL Workbench. If I selected these things out, I would have a bunch of headers. And then if I had, say, 4 films in my database, I would have 1, 2, 3, 4 rows. The way that this result set here works is that initially points before the first one. Then what I can do is I can go rs.next. Give me the next result. I can do that again. Next, next, next. It'll just simply go down the line. The first row, then the second row, then the third row, then the fourth row. What happens when I no longer have any rows? It can't go any further. Right? This is actually returning a Boolean. If you look at this, it returns a there, right there. Results argument, not arguments Boolean, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this into a while loop. I want to process all of these things instead of just 4 records. I don't know how many records there are in the database unless you go through and you do a count query, but then you'd still need to iterate over a result set anyway, so there's no point. I'm putting this into a while loop because the way that this works is every time I go rs.next, 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 it's also returning a Boolean. True, it's pointing to a valid record. True, it's pointing to a valid record. Next, true, it's pointing to a valid record. True, it's pointing to a valid record. When it no longer points to a valid record, it returns false, breaking you out of this loop. So this will end up processing every single result all the way down. It does pagination automatically, depending on the driver, meaning that it will go out to your database and pull, say, 100 records. When you get done with those 100 records, then it'll go back and get the next 100 records, etc. It doesn't, if there are a billion records or something, it doesn't transfer all billion records all at once, and then you start processing them. You process them on the fly, and then it just goes back and forth between the database. Pagination is what that's called. Right? You get pages of data instead. All right. So, by the way, if you're only expecting 1 or no records, or you just want to check if there is a record, if rs.next. That'll return true if there is 1 record. It'll return false if there were no records at all. So if you have a result set that's empty, right? Initially it's pointing to before the first record, rs.next immediately jumps after, returning false. So you can check to see if there are records or check to see if there are multiple records. Like if you expect only 1 record, you can do an if next, rs.next, and then do your business logic here. And then you can check, is there another record? If rs.next, whoa, there are too many records. I'm only expecting 1 because you expect a one-to-one relationship or something, right? So you can program it like that, but I'm just going to keep it simple. And I know that I'm going to have multiple films in this database, so I'm going to iterate over all of them. Now, once I am pointing to 1 particular record, now I'm pointing at 1 row. That row has multiple columns. I want to get each one of those columns so that I can build my objects. So I asked the result set to give me I want the director ID. The director ID is a integer. So I'll tell the result set, give me an integer. Get int and director ID. Director ID. There we go. And then of course I need to capture it. Int director ID is equal to this. Right? There. I just need to give it the name of the column, and that's it. What about the director's first name? Now, that's not an integer, it's a string. Actually, it's a varchar, but does Java have varchars? Nope, so it automatically changes a varchar into a string. And I will have first name, last name, what else do we want? Title. And the film ID. Int film ID is equal to rs.getInt of film ID. There we go. Now that I've got all these pieces of data, I can build my objects. Director D is equal to new director with the director ID, the first name, and the last name. All right. Now I've got my director. I can create my film. New film with the film ID, the title, and then the director that I just built, D. And then I can add it to my list. Films.add. There. So I processed this. This goes for each row. Then the first column, second column, there's really no ordering to the column. That's why I'm naming them. If I wanted the first column, second column, third column, then that's going to take some guesswork here, and it's probably going to require some an explicit list up here. Okay. Let's see if it works. All I'm doing is loading all the films and printing one out, printing them all out. And if it works, nobody changed my password. Excellent. Those are the 5 films that I think that we did 2 weeks ago, or a week and a half ago. Star Wars, American Graffiti, THX 1138, Pan's Labyrinth, and Hellboy. I haven't changed the database since. And you saw the directors there as well. That was just the 2-string method that I overloaded in the director, in the film object. All right. Are we done? It all looked good. Except that, yeah, what? I need to clean up. Failure to clean up means that you will basically might be wasting resources. One of the most expensive things that you can have is a network connection. This opens up a network connection to the remote database server on CSE. There is memory and CPU cycles being wasted on the server. There's memory and CPU cycles being wasted on my computer, but that's peanuts compared to the actual bandwidth that you are wasting keeping things open. Also, the most expensive thing that you can do with a database connection is that initial ramp up, that handshake back and forth to establish the connection, and then the ramp down to close the connection. One solution that we'll talk about at the end is using a connection pool, where you're not doing that over and over again. Instead, you open up say 30 connections, and you put them in a pool and reuse them instead of making new connections. But here, the way that I've done this is I've opened it up. I need to clean it up. I need to close that connection. Except that that's not the only resource. The connection owns, through composition, the prepared statement. The prepared statement owns a result set. So all of those have to be cleaned up too. Now, why did I go in that order? We'll resolve the compiler issues here in a second. I opened up the connection. I created my prepared statement, and then I executed the prepared statement and got my result set. I went in reverse order. Why? Because of composition. If one thing owns another, then you have to clean up the child, then clean up the parent, then clean up the grandparent, if you want to look at it that way. Right? And it's complaining here because, again, everything throws an SQL exception. So try and catch and release. This is still not 100% robust. If something failed up here and the result set never got set, then you need to check for that. If RS is not null, then we can close it. Because if it was null and you tried to call this close method on it, you'd get a null pointer exception. But if it's already closed, then you don't want to close it again. So if it's not already closed, is closed, then you go ahead and close it. So if it's not null, that means that it exists and you can do things with it. If it's closed, then you already closed, then don't close it again. So if it's not already closed, then you do close it. And you can do the same pattern with the other 3. There we go. RS, PS, 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 con, and con. There we go. Now, an alternative way of doing this, a couple of alternative ways of doing this. One alternative way of doing this is to have everything in one big try catch and cleaning up your resources in a finally block, right? And you can do that as well. You just don't have as much fine-grained control over stuff. Especially if you're doing stuff in practice where you have to insert 3 records. And if the third one fails, you want to make sure that you roll it back so that it never happened. And if you want something like that, you might need a little bit more fine-grained control. It really depends on what you're trying to do. The way that I demonstrated this is that just each block I separated into its own try-catch. You can go ahead and with one big giant try-catch and then finally and close the resources in the finally. That would require a finally and then another try and then another finally, and now you've got nested try-catches, and ad infinitum. You've got to stop it somewhere, so I'm just going to stop it right here. Let's run it again, see that everything works still. Yep. Still those 5 films right there. Okay. All right. That's reading from the database. And all you would need to do to change this is change, your query, and then change how you're processing the result set. Otherwise, it's the same basic 5-step process. You need to load your driver, potentially. You only actually need to do that once usually, but if you have no control over which function gets called first, then you'd have to do it in a main or something like that. So generally, I would do this in some sort of a connection factory class, maybe statically. You have to create your connection, and again, maybe you can create another class or a static method that does that for you. Then you have to create prepare your query, execute it, process the results, and then clean up after yourself. But what if you need to create new records? So to demonstrate that, I'm going to create a function here that adds a new director record to the database. Let's see, public static void, add new director. There we go. Now, what are we going to need to add a new director here? A director is an ID, primary key, auto increment, not null, and a first name and a last name. So do I need to specify the ID? I don't need to. In fact, I probably shouldn't programmatically. There's a director in there with ID 10 already. Then I'm not going to be able to insert a new record with an ID of 10. Let the database do its job. Let it do the auto increment itself. So all I really need is a first name and a last name. Okay? Same 5-step process. In fact, I will commit a cardinal sin or venial sin of copy pasta. Cardinal, thank you. Good. I agree. Excommunicated now. All right. So load the Jdbc driver. All right. Make your connection. That's copy paste. That's again, maybe you want to put that somewhere else and reuse it. But here's my new query. How do I insert a new record into the director table? Insert. Oh, we don't remember? Into director. The last name, first name, values. Oh, and then how do I do this? How do I put in the last name and the first name? Well, those are strings, right? I can go ahead and concatenate them. Last name, and then concatenate first name. Knowing that the last name comes first and the first name comes last, right? So if you thought copy pasta was a cardinal sin, this is the worst thing you can ever do. Right? Never do something like this. Concatenating means that you are not sanitizing your SQL inputs, and means that you're opening yourself up for what's called an SQL injection attack, where somebody can potentially execute arbitrary SQL code into your database without any credentials whatsoever. So we're not going to do that. Instead, I'm going to go back to what I had before and say, I don't know. Oops, there we go. Question mark, question mark. I'm leaving those question marks because those are special symbols. They are placeholder symbols that can be replaced automatically by Jdbc, by the prepared statement. I'm not going to have a result set here because I'm putting something into the database, so I'll get rid of that. I'll prepare my statement here, but before I execute it, I need to set those parameters. I need to set this first parameter, and I need to set the second parameter. To do that, I will set, right? This is just the opposite of getters. So instead of getting a last name out of the result set, I will be setting the first name in the prepared statement. Set string, and the string value that I want is the last name. Last name's first and the first name's last. And the second parameter is the first name. There. Now, one weird thing that you'll notice automatically, how do I index the first parameter? With a 1. Indexing starts at 1. It's really weird. It is what it is. Again, everything else in computer science is 0 indexing because of how array indexes work. These are not arrays, so they went with ordinal, I think you'd call it, ordinal indexing, where you start at 1 because people don't start counting at 0, 1, 2, 3. Although they should, right? Especially if you're counting time, right? If you're counting time and you're counting, give me 5 seconds, and you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's not 5 seconds, is it? Because you said 1 too quickly. So you go 0, 1,000, 1, 1,000. Now that's the 1 second, right? And that gives you 5 full seconds. That's ordinal counting versus, what's the opposite? Anybody know? Or what? 0 index-based counting? I don't know. But this is ordinal. It starts at 1, right? The first, the second, the third, the fourth, that's ordinals. We don't say the 0th, right? And that's why it's not ordinal. Okay, once I've set those things, then I can actually execute that statement. It's a different method that you call. It's execute update. There we go. But wait a second, that's not an update statement. That's an insert statement. Doesn't matter. Any write operation to the database is an execute update method. There's no execute insert. There's no execute delete. Delete, insert, update, all three of those things of CRUD are done with execute update. Right. And we can get rid of all this stuff. There. And clean up after yourself after you're done. There we go. And I didn't have a result set, so I only need to clean up the prepared statement and then clean up the connection. Now, what if you had an entire list of directors that you wanted to put into your database? Well, you could put this prepared state these 3 lines into a loop and reset those values on each iteration if you wanted to. It would it would re-prepare the statement with those 2 values, and then it would execute that and keep inserting. You'd end up reusing the connection and reusing the prepared statement, which is actually more efficient than if you'd done a bunch of unprepared statements. If you had something like, oh, here we go. Let's go ahead and make sure that it works. We used UEBowl in the morning class. Give me another director. The more obscure, the better, because I think we've inserted several popular directors already. No? Nobody knows any directors. Ridley Scott. Oh, it was a first name, last name? He's not obscure, but what was it? First name first? First name, there we go. Ridley Scott. There we go. Let's not insert new director. What was it? Add new director. There we go. Everybody knows Ridley Scott then, right? Okay. Legends? Or Legend? One of his first. Or Alien, the first one. What else? Well, Blade Runner, the original Blade Runner. Right? No? Okay, and then crap like, what's the Gladiator one? No, it's Gladiator, right? Yeah. This garbage ever since then. Right? All right, but anyway, let's go ahead and add that new director. I'll go ahead and execute this, and we won't see this because, of course, we put stuff into the database. We would need to write more code to pull stuff out of the database. But if you want to, we can go ahead and see what it looks like. MySQL work. If I just open up MySQL Workbench and make a really quick connection here to my database. Just for 156. All right. Ignore. Select or use my database. Again, you don't have to use your database because you put it into the URL. But then we'll go ahead and select everything from director And we can see that, there we go, there it is. He was successfully inserted. Just to prove to you that that wasn't a sham, give me one. Oh, I know. Kevin Smith. There we go. Oh, I need to run this. And again, I'm not going to get anything there, but if I look over here, then I can see that Kevin Smith is now in the database. So programmatically putting stuff in, programmatically pulling stuff out of the database, the same 5-step process. That you would that we just followed here, by the way, that I made the connection, I made my query here, I executed my query, and then I can process the results by looking at them here in this case. Right. Okay. Any questions on that so far? No? Then, best practices. Like I said, dealing with SQL exceptions, just rethrow them, catch and release. Unfortunately, most of the operations, in fact, all of the operations in the Jdbc API are going to throw a checked SQL exception that you have to surround with a try catch or that you have to do something with. Just catch it and release it and rethrow it as a runtime exception, and you should be good. You may want to log it and then rethrow it if you really want. And I'll show this to you since we have enough time here. I'll show you what I'm talking about because also it's worth bonus or required for this, this section. If you do logging, then use a proper library. System.out and system.error are not proper logging systems. Nobody is sitting there staring at the screen waiting for system.out to print something and then jumping on, oh, wow, something happened, I need to jump and start debugging and stuff like that. Instead, logs are put to text files, log files. Or if there's a severe enough issue, we could configure our logging system to email an administrator that the database is down, do something about it. Or we could have it persist to another database, so we can have all of our database errors in our database, so that we can run database queries on our database errors. Right? We could do a lot of sophisticated stuff, but we can't do that with system.out. We can only do it with a proper logging system. I'll show that at the end here. Always use prepared statements. In fact, I don't even cover unprepared statements because you should never use them. In general, strings can contain anything that you want to put in there. They could contain SQL code. Without sanitizing your input, your code, you're susceptible to an SQL injection attack. A user could enter, say, if they've got a text box, where they could just type whatever they want. Instead of typing their username, they could type some well-formatted SQL injection code so that if you are using string concatenation and just putting your SQL code, their SQL code that they've injected, then you are allowing that to run on your database unchecked, unsanitized. The classic example here, let me go ahead and pull it up, is the XKCD comic, XKCD. Exploits of the mom. There we go. Hi, this is your son's school. We're having some computer trouble. Oh dear, did he break something in a way? Did you really name your son Robert? And then SQL code, drop table, students, more SQL code. And that comment at the end is to ignore whatever remaining SQL code was at the end of your concatenation. Oh yeah, and then the question mark is just the speaker making the question. Oh yes, little Bobby Tables, we call him. Well, we've lost this year's student records. Hope you're happy. I hope you've learned to sanitize your database inputs. Right? Because they were able, now there are lots of things that went wrong with this if this actually happened. First of all, you never configure your MySQL or your database to allow compound queries to begin with. You never use unprepared statements. But to this day, this is the one of the number one attack vectors still in most applications. Unsanitized input, unsanitized output. We run, if you, not this week's lab, but next week's lab, we run you through an HTML injection attack, where you can, if on Facebook, if you were allowed to type in a paragraph of your profile, what you can do is you can put in some HTML injections. And then when your profile is, if it's not sanitized, if the output is not sanitized, then when your profile displays to somebody, then your custom HTML code is displayed instead of Facebook's HTML code. In fact, correct me if I'm wrong, but several years ago, there was still a persistent problem with Facebook that allowed something like this, and some user had reported it, for a bug bounty, they had not responded. They had not responded. So after a certain amount of time, he said, "All right, fine." And so he put in some SQL or some HTML injection to make his profile look like Mark Zuckerberg, right? That's the guy, right? And so and then of course then he announced it to everybody. Hey, look, everybody, I'm Mark Zuckerberg now, because he was just calling them out and their failure to listen to him and to listen to his bug report. And you have these things all over the place. Yeah. Exactly. The one that we demonstrate in your lab, not this week but next week, is way more innocuous. It just redirects you to my web page and asks you for a password. Hopefully you don't fall for it. But even if you do fall for it, I do keep a log file and I look to see, it's mostly just people saying, "Ha ha, nice try," or whatever. But if you get the unsophisticated user and you make it look like it's actually the Wells Fargo web page or whatever, then you can pretty much get away with a lot of stuff. And it's all injection attacks. You need to sanitize inputs. You need to sanitize outputs, and so that you don't allow arbitrary code injection. Right? Again, it's still the number one attack vector, right? Mostly with PHP garbage, but never use anything else. And for design reasons too, if you are accessing your database 50 different ways, then you have 50 different possible failure points. You just use one way and go with that way and make sure that you know what you're doing, right? Simplify. Simpler code is more robust code. It's more maintainable code. Fewer points of failure. Avoid using the star operator like I did. Let's go back and fix it now. Where was that? Here. Oh, I don't know how that was working. Maybe okay, there we go. I used the star operator here, which if you remember, let's describe film. Film had a whole bunch of other things, right? Not just title and film ID and director ID. We had a release date, IMDb rating, gross earnings, EIDR. If I use the star operator, all that data that I ultimately ignore is still being sent over the wire. Why send bytes over the wire that you're ultimately going to ignore? Be more intentional about that. F.film ID, F.title, D.director ID, D.first name, D.last name. And then, of course, you can alias all those things if you want to, or you can break it up line by line so that each one of these, I'm not going to align it all, but you get the idea. You can make it look pretty. That does not look pretty. In fact, what would it look like if I just went back to regular? Oh, wow. That's even worse. Undo that. Oh, it's not going to let me undo that. Oh, okay, there we go. All right, so make it look pretty. Always write your SQL queries in an IDE like MySQL Workbench. Once you've got them debugged and you know what they're doing and it's exactly what you want, then do a copy pasta over into your Java code. Otherwise, if there's an error with your SQL syntax here, or you forget a space, right? You forget a space like that, then it's just going to manifest itself as a runtime error that doesn't work, like this. Right? There. SQL exception. There's an error with your syntax here. Director D that doesn't exist. Well, that's because I didn't put in a space right there, and it would be really not apparent if I had gone to the next line. It's not apparent at all that there's a space missing here because I broke it on to the next line. So make sure that you're breaking it up nicely and that it looks nice and that you can read it so that you avoid these kind of errors. Let's run it again, make sure that it works. Yep, still works. Okay. All right. Avoid using the star operator. It also protects you against changes in the database. So the example that I did this morning was, what if I want to change my movie database to an innocent database that keeps track of all the movies that I've watched, and I want to change it into a BitTorrent database that stores the actual, binary, we call them blobs, binary large objects. I BitTorrented all these movies. What were they? I BitTorrented the original. It's not worth it to BitTorrent the original Star Wars, but you should BitTorrent the, what is it called? Not the special edition. The the what? No, 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 the Christmas special. You can watch that on YouTube. No, the one where the non-special editions that were cleaned up and digitally remastered by fans. Oh, nobody has ever heard of this? No, no. So Lucas went back and mucked with everything and changed and edited stuff out. You want the original, unscrewed with Star Wars, but you want it digitally remastered. So they went back to the original, like laser discs and all that stuff. There's a name for it. Nobody knows this? Okay, I'm gonna have to ask Steve for it again. I forget what the official name was for it, but you can BitTorrent the original Star Wars. I'm sure that Disney would not want you doing that at all, so don't do that. But suppose that I did that and I stored that in my database, and I use the star operator. Well, guess what? That 4 gigs of an actual film stored in my database is going to get sent over the wire, even though I only wanted the ID, the title, and the other stuff so that I could display it in a web page or something. Right? So it protects you from changes in the underlying data model if somebody decides to add a blob field to your table. And we do call those blobs, binary large objects. Right? Additional issues, security. Again, access should always be minimized. So if you've got an application that is its only purpose is to go to the database, pull a bunch of data, and display it, then you should only give it view access. That application that was never designed or intended to write to the database, maybe you want to cut them off from that possibility entirely so that nobody screws up and accidentally does write to the database. Or maybe that's a further protection against SQL injection attacks because they only have read access. They can't write anything to it. Never store sensitive information in the database unhashed or unencrypted. This would include passwords. In fact, don't do password management on your own. If you're ever actually doing a real application, use a single sign-on service. Google offers it. You sign in. You go to websites. You sign in with Google credentials, right? They never see your password. They just have an agreement with Google. Or actually, I don't even think it costs anything. You can just integrate it directly. GitHub is another option. Facebook is another option. All you need to do is pull their code, and when somebody tries to sign into your application, you redirect them to the single sign-on service. They sign on over here. They grant permission for your application to get their ID. You never see their password at all. You just have a confirmation from Google or Facebook or GitHub that they are who they say they are, that they passed the password test. So don't do it. Right? Password management, security is very, very difficult. Let somebody else do it. Right? Efficiency issues. Always close your resources. You are limited to 30 connections with CSE. If you open up 30 connections, your 31st connection will be rejected and it'll crash your program with a runtime exception. Hopefully, they'll eventually be reset, or you do close them, but you might get stuck where I think it's a 5-minute timeout. If you open up all your connections and your program crashes and they never got cleaned up and they're still persistent and you have no way of closing them, you just got to wait 5 minutes for them to close themselves because it'll time out and close all those. But don't get yourself into that situation. Make sure that you're closing your resources. Connection pools are another nice solution. Again, the most expensive thing that you can do is that initial handshake of creating the connection. What you can do is you could say, okay, well, I'll pay for that up front. I'll open up 30 connections and put them into a pool. That's a pool of resources. Now, your application, instead of making a new connection every time you want one, you go to the pool and you check one out, like a library book. When you're done with it, instead of closing it, you put it back into the pool so that other people can use it, other processes can use it. You're not writing anything that is multi-threaded, so this is not that big of an issue. But if you do want, in practice, if you were really doing a real application, you would want some sort of a connection pool, and you'd want to bring in a library to do it. The library that I know best is C3PO. So you have more connections to Star Wars all over the place. Right? All right, good normalization also gives you generally good performance. So make sure that you've got a very good, very well-designed database. Finally, with our last remaining time here, I want to talk a little bit about a proper logging system. In a real system, nobody's sitting there staring at a screen looking for errors or, oh, hey, somebody just logged in, right? Unless you're really bored and you want to see what's going on. So the standard output is not sufficient because there's not somebody sitting there 24/7 looking at the output, waiting for errors or waiting for things to happen. Instead, you want to automate that process. Real logging means that logging information to files or databases or something else, maybe email for really critical errors. Generally, a good logging system also has a lot of features. If you're logging to a file, for example, you don't want an infinitely long file, right? You maybe want to say, well, at most, my file should be no more than 1 megabyte. So the logging system will fill up a file, and then when it hits that 1 megabyte limit, it'll say, okay, there's my old logging file, new logging file, and we'll start over. You can even have it be rolling so that it only keeps the last 10 of those things. Or you can make it time-based so that each day a new file is created, and then the old file is saved off, and then maybe you keep the last week, 7 days of logging, and then the oldest one is deleted automatically by the logging system. All these really nice features that you don't get with system.out, right? It provides data like login, data you can do auditing, you can do metrics like how many times did this this login ID log in over the last week. We do this all the time with the grader, right? In fact, I've directed the LAs and my graders to, in fact, Hunter did this. He took the system logs that we'd been keeping anyway, and now they're displayed to all the graders so they can see when did they start grading. Oh, the night before, 10 minutes before the due date. Probably not. They note that in their grading rubrics. And so we do keep that data because those are the kinds of metrics that can be useful, not just with grading, but with anything. Like when did the system go down? How long was it down? Who was logged in at the time that the system was there? You can backtrack all that with logs. You can't do that with system.out. Right? The one that I'm going to show you is Log4j. It's pretty standard. And I've already downloaded it. In fact, I downloaded Log4j version 2. And those are these two files right here, these two jar files. I assume that you can Google for them, you can download them, and you can pull out those two jar files yourselves. Here's what the original looked like. Let's see, where is it? Apache? It's an Apache library. It came with a whole bunch of jar files. The only ones that you need are the API and the core. I brought those in. Right? Now what we're going to do is we're going to set ourselves up with a logger. Okay, let's go into the film class here and create a logger. Right. Let's do that. I forget what the qualified path name is, so I'm going to look that up. Here we go. I'm just going to bring this over. And this is the film class. So I will go ahead and create a logger here. And I've already imported this stuff, org.apache.logging, log4j, logger, and log manager. I've created a static logger here called log. Some people like to use all uppercase or static things. In fact, I make it public final, static final. I'd probably do final too if I were going to do that. And I've got log here. And now you can use log everywhere, right? Is everybody too young for Ren and Stimpy? Ren and Stimpy? Yeah, the cartoon show. Exactly. Yeah, the log. Right? That is the Christmas present that everybody wanted. Oh boy, log. Right? So log. So instead of just throwing the runtime exception, I will log it as well. I will log it as an error. Not at error. That's just my IDE. Something bad happened. Right? And then you can also print a stack trace into your log by providing the exception that you just caught. If you just want to echo some information, you can have log.info. And again, there are several different levels of logging. So information is just information, like this thing happened, like we loading all films, ... right? Or whatever you want. There's also warn, error, and I believe trace and debug. Those are even lower level, like debug. You can shut those off when you actually go to production. Debug, info, warnings, and errors. And on a production system, maybe you only want warnings and errors, or maybe you want information or whatever, but you certainly don't want debugging information. You can configure that once it gets onto the server. And then that stuff may not end up in the actual log files. You can set up a whole bunch of things, but I'm going to keep it simple, and I'm going to set up just a default configuration over here in my main. If I run this, of course, it's not going to do anything because it hasn't been configured, right? It's not logging anything. I need to configure it. I'm going to do that by a configurator, initialize the default configuration. Let me go ahead and get rid of this for a second here and show you that still nothing's going to happen because by default, it's only logging, I believe, warnings and errors, maybe just errors. And of course, there are no errors here, so it was fine. I will reset that so that the default root level is info. And that info log message that I created when you call this method is now actually going to print. Right? By default, it's just going to print back to the standard output. But of course, you can set up your configuration to log to a file instead, or a rolling file, or a daily rolling file. Or you can configure it so that that for errors, it emails you immediately with a message. You can, but for information, well, that just goes to a file. Debug, maybe we'll put that over to a database for whatever reason, just because we wanted something different. Lots of configuration is possible with this, and it's a proper logging, and that's only possible with a proper logging system. That's not possible with system.out. Right? And you see by default here, it's the time, the method that caused or that made the log, the level, the fully qualified class that it's associated with, and then the actual message here. Let's actually see what it looks like when an error occurs. So let's see, something happened. Let's do that down here. And I'll make the wrong password there, and we can see that in action here. There. And there's the logging system repeating the stack trace. This is where I rethrew it, and then it got logged to the standard error, system.error. But this is this right here. Something bad happened, and then it's followed by the stack trace. And it happened exactly 600 milliseconds after the first log. So you can like time things and do analytics and stuff with a logging system like this. All right, any questions? No? All right, then. Again, I might just start doing OBS